Thank you so much for tuning into a second episode of FPS, Friendly Professional Storytime. Today, we have a new special guest, and we'll have Caitlin take it away.
Yeah, so you guys, we're back whether you like it or not. And today our guest is Jesse Murphy. So if you guys remember the panel we had a couple months ago, Jesse was one of the guests on that. And we're so grateful that he accepted our invitation to be here and talk to us today. Just a little background on Jesse. He's the co-founder of Jesse James Films, which is a venture that places an emphasis on bringing engaging intellectual property to the screen. Most recently, he wrapped production on Chick Fight starring Alec Baldwin, and some other things you may know him from include Hooking Up, which stars Brittany Stowe and Sam Richardson, Marlon on NBC, Wookish on Netflix, and I think that just dropped like a couple weeks ago. And also The Bay on Amazon, which he won a Daytime Emmy for in 2017. So welcome to Jesse, yay!
Hi guys.
So you guys, today, last time we talked a bit about networking, and today we're gonna do a bit of a dive into what goes on behind the camera, I guess you can say, because we're in a film club and we make a lot of short films, but we don't actually know how the film industry works. So Jesse's gonna help shed some light on that today.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead with the first question. So, one term we keep hearing about is this term script coverage, which is the usual starting point for those interested in development. But the word development seems like a very cloudy, not clear, vague word for us. So, could you give us a brief overview of what development is? What does development entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll start by saying, I think at this point in the entertainment industry, if you're not self-generating your own ideas, um, it you're starting with a hand behind your back. So even if you are an actor, I would always recommend that you write as well. But if you are a traditional writer or director, it's very important that you have quantity as well as quality. So I'm a big advocate of making sure you have multiple projects in what we would call development. So when I think of development, it means that you have an idea and it's in a various stage that would be before what we would call pre-production. So you have pre-production, production, post-production, distribution, and then the property's out. But before everything before pre-production would constitute as development. And that could be you and your friends getting together and putting down a bunch of ideas and creating what we would call a one page or a synopsis or a log line or a treatment to a Bible, to writing the actual pilot or writing the feature. But once you have the screenplay or the pilot finished, development usually involves the word packaging, which is attaching a director or attaching a senior production company or attaching an actor or attaching a senior writer who's been there before and has had movies made that they're willing to put their name on it and work with you if you're a younger writer. Everything leading up to the day you take that project into what we would call a buyer. And a buyer can be from the most popular ones, when you think of Warner Brothers, Universal, Paramount, to smaller indie house buyers, all the way to just traditional financiers. And this doesn't have to be a $50 million movie. You could be raising 50 grand for your first short film. And I would say development would be everything leading up to the moment that you get the financing from that family friend or from that person who is presenting the means to enter pre-production. So that is what I think of when I think of development, if that's helpful. And then when you're talking about script coverage, so script coverage is when you're in this development phase and you're a younger writer and you're submitting your script to an agency, a management firm, a production company, a network, a studio, um, anywhere that's receiving what we would call mass submissions, just a multitude of submissions coming in, they usually have a filtration system to weed out the scripts that are good and the scripts that are not so good. So what they do for that is they have a coverage department. And a coverage department mainly consists of interns or assistants who are reviewing, they're the gatekeepers. They're the first people that are going to be reading your scripts. And they put together a summary of what the screenplay is about or what the pilot is about. And then they talk, so they have the summary and then they have the comment section, which is why they should or why they should not pursue the property. And each company has their own template, but they're all somewhat generic. And there's usually a grid on them. So that way the producer or the executive can filter through these very quickly. So I can see on the grid if it's got, excellent for 3 boxes, character, story, marketability, etc. I know that I'm probably going to want to read that summary that's 1 or 2 pages. If it has fair and poor checked off on most of the boxes, I'm probably not. It's just, we're going to move on pretty quickly. But the reason it exists in my world and where we see it a lot with producers and agents and managers is we don't have time to read all the scripts. And so I have an agent who sends me a young writer, and there are times when I'm not going to be able to have read the script. So what I rely on is a great piece of script coverage that I'll read, then call the agent and pass based off of the script coverage. So if you get very good at writing coverage, the agents tend to notice, or the producers tend to notice and say, who's the intern that wrote this? And those are like one of the first things we look for, because someone who's able to write good script coverage has the ability to become a good executive because they can give good page notes, or you'll train them to give good page notes. But if they're not good at writing script coverage, it's very hard to get them to move beyond the basic administration work that an assistant would be doing.
Gotcha. And you kind of talked about kind of the jump from intern doing script coverage all the way to execs.
Yeah, so that was super clear. So thank you so much for that. A lot of our friends, we know that some of their first jobs in the film industry is like, being a script coverage intern. Another place we hear people clamoring to be is the mailroom. So could you tell us a bit about like what is the mailroom and why we should want to be there?
Yeah. The mailroom. So I'm a product of the mailroom, as are a lot of my friends. The mailroom is a program designed by tier 1 agencies to train the next generation of agents, and it's a place where they all have to start. So when you hear the word mailroom, it is very much literal. You are delivering the mail to the agents, which seems a bit heartbreaking for someone who went to UCLA for 4 years and got a 4-year degree and spent $100,000 on an education. But the mailroom is full of some of the most educated kids in the world. I mean, my class had a lawyer from Dartmouth, 2 kids from Yale, Stanford graduate. And so there are a bunch of these young kids, and they're all working for minimum wage. Although I think CA just raised we were all working for minimum wage, I'll tell you that. And you're working, very long hours, you're making minimum wage. it's a program that helps weed out, I don't want to say the weak, but it is a program that helps weed out who really wants to be there. But the great thing about the mailroom is the optics that it allows you to see. So, for example, inside of an agency, the agencies cover all the networks and studios and production companies. So there's so much information inside of those walls that if you just went to go work for a casting office, or if you went to go work for a writer or a director or a producer, you're very limited in the amount of information you're granted to see. Where if you're working in the mailroom, all the contents are flowing through those doors. So it's a great place to start if you know exactly what you want to do and become an agent. And it's also a great place to start if you have no idea what you want to do, but you know you want to be in entertainment, because it'll show you all the different jobs in depth, and you can make a better educated choice for your next move after you do your year in the mailroom.
Gotcha. Uh, and earlier you kind of talked about packaging already, and I remember in the briefing, the pre-planning meeting we had, you kind of talked about the 5 essential components of a packaging, almost like an equation. Can you kind of talk more about that? What are some of the components of that packaging equation?
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's funny. The only class I actually failed in college was film producing. So it's very odd that I'm sitting here talking about the mechanics of it. But there's 5 elements that I look for, and you know, I would say this business is there's some things that are just absolute truths, and then there are um, personal beliefs and niches that a lot of people look to find. For myself, and I would say it's pretty general, but for myself, what I look to do is it's a 5 point system, which is comprised of 5 elements. If I have 3, I'll take it to a buyer, is the bare minimum. If I have 4, I'm really excited to take it to a buyer. And if I have all 5, um, that tends to be the best package. But really, before I go to a buyer, I won't even approach a buyer until I have 3 elements. So the first element is intellectual property. In my company, every single thing we produce is based on intellectual property. So that one's a bit specific to what I'm doing. But the first element for me is intellectual property. The second element for me is the writer. Third element is the director. The fourth element is the production partner. And the fifth element is the talent. So I'll give you an example. And so all 5 elements need to be what I would call financeable. So for example, an article in the New York Times is far more valuable to me than an article in the UCLA Gazette. The New York Times article has intrinsic value to it because of the eyeballs that it attracts. So for example, it's going to have 10 million viewers at least that are going to read that property, where if you have a college campus paper, it's far less.
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying to create what's called a built-in audience. So properties that I get excited about would be like the New York Times, Vanity Fair, GQ, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, any elevated periodical usually has some intrinsic value.
Mm-hmm.
The second element is the writer. So if you say, well, I'm a writer and I wrote this amazing screenplay, my rebuttal would be, yes, but you're worth $0. And it is nothing against you as a person or you as a writer. You could be the best writer in the world, but unless you've had a film produced by the networks or studios or streaming platforms where someone fronted millions of dollars on your words and it turned a profit for that buyer, you're not worth much. So the second thing I look for is a financeable writer. The same is true of a director. So if you're a first-time director or you've done a bunch of short films, But again, it hasn't gone to theatrical, or it hasn't been backed by millions of dollars and received its distributor and recouped its investment, you're probably not financeable. Um, so, and then again, talent, same thing. And then production company, I always look to pair with a production company who has what's called a first look or an overall deal at a network or a studio. And again, that's just enhancing credibility. These people are paid a lot of money to be exclusive to certain studios and networks. So having shows with them enhances the credibility of the package. But what I will say is, when you're building out that package, it's not to say that if you're a first time writer, you can't get your movie made for $20 million. But you really need to look at the 5 elements. So if you say, I'm a writer who currently holds no intrinsic value, but I own the rights to a GQ article that has intrinsic value, and you get a director who goes, wow, that GQ article is really interesting, and I really like this young kid's script. Sure, I'll put my name on this as a director. Well, now you've got 2 financeable elements. So then you go to a senior production company and you say, hey, I've got this financeable director with this really interesting piece in GQ. And yeah, unfortunately, it's a baby writer, but I'll take a gamble and sign the property anyways. That's an example where you would have 3 of the 5 elements and a first-time writer gets his shot. Now, it's a lot easier said than done. It takes years to package, so don't get frustrated in the packaging process. And that's where quantity really, really becomes important, because if you spend your entire life trying to push through one project, it might take you 3 to 5 years. But if you have 20 projects and you're pushing them for 3 to 5 years, at the end of 5 years, you should be able to have set up a system where you're making a movie a year.
Gotcha. And
Cool.
we kind of talked about this idea that, you know, you might be in development, but as a creative, you have that one passion project, that one thing you really needs to get it done. How does that play into this idea of quantity while having quality? Do you preserve like one thing that's you're really passionate while developing simultaneously many projects, or that idea of one passion project is more for development side when you're doing producing while being creative?
No, it's a great question. I'm a big believer that if you're in UCLA's film program or theater program, right, there's probably what I would call like a creative itch. There's something in you that said, I'm willing to spend $50,000 on a career with 96% unemployment rate, right? There's like definitely something in you that goes, man, I'm aware the odds are insane, but I'm going to try this and I really want to do it. More often than not, there's usually something tied to that. So for example, like there is one story that director really wants to tell. There's this one screenplay idea that this young writer has, and he's going to UCLA to figure out how the hell to get it made, right? You're making the investment in it.
Mm-hmm.
My belief is, and this is probably a bit outside of just entertainment, but more a life conversation. I think most people are unhappy in their professions. I think most people consider work work. And my dad always said there's a reason they call it work. But I think, and I'm not saying that I'm not one of those people. I think there's a lot of horrible things about my job. But if you don't have that creative itch, that one thing that you're chasing, that you
Mm-hmm.
wake up for in the morning, you're probably going to suck at everything you do. You're probably going to suck at your job because you really don't give a shit about your job. You're probably going to sleep an extra hour because you have no reason to get up. You're probably not going to go to the gym. You're probably not going to, right? It's like all these things compound. And so my belief is you always have to have something, one project that you're waking up for. And that project does not have to make you money. For example, for me, I'm writing a poetry book right now. It's going to make me nothing, right? but it's the reason that I'm getting up in the morning. That should never be confused with a lack of value. So, for example, value is based on the financeability of a package, like we're talking about. You
Hmm.
can have very financeable packages that you're not passionate about as much as the very cheap project that you want to do or the very expensive project that you want to do. So you have to always continue to have financeable packages as you develop, but never lose sight of the thing that you want to do. But be
Hmm.
very careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is I see tons of kids that are assistants at some of the greatest companies in the world, and they're aspiring writers, and they do it for 3 years. And in 1 year, they would have became a junior executive and could have been on the path to having a very financially secure, healthy life and still have worked on their movie. But instead, they leave their job at 26, 27 years old to become a full-time writer, and they chase their passion, but there's no means of stability in that model.
Hmm.
So I'm just a big believer in like, what is that degree of balance that works for you without forfeiting your creative edge?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was super helpful in kind of telling us that kind of the balance between financeability and kind of passion project. You have to have stability in life, finance yourself, and then have the passion project for you to get up every day for. So thank you.
Yeah. So speaking of financeability, Jesse, you're a person who does a lot of selling, but I kind of want to talk a little bit about buying, just in terms of like sales and distribution. What kind of person, or actually scratch that, let me just say, how do you get involved with like those areas of the industry? Is it like, is there a way to start out in those areas if you're interested in marketing or something like that, and that's the kind of route you're looking to go to? Or is it just another like mailroom work your way up type of situation?
No, it was a great question. And no, so if you wanted to be in distribution or marketing or publicity, or there's tons of different avenues that you can be, you can be completely in the industry. But those jobs are great for a lot of reasons. So here's what I'll say about that. My job as a producer comes with an extreme degree of risk reward. So most producers' contracts at a network or a studio are for 2 years with the option to renew for the third year, right? Well, that means every 700 days I'm unemployed. I need to get my contract renewed or I am unemployed. If I get a movie made, I receive a large fee for making that, for getting that movie into production with the buyer. So there's a mass reward for the risk. If you're someone who loves movies and you're someone who loves movies, is a theater TV junkie, wants to be a part of the entertainment business, but is someone who is a bit more conservative or risk averse, or who is not comfortable living in a state of you know financial fluctuation consistently, working in sales, working in distribution, working in publicity are great avenues, because you get to work on the packaging of what the marketing materials are going to look like. You get to go to the opening nights, you're at the premieres, you're on the phone with the producers and the actors, getting their creative input on what they think about the way you're marketing the picture. A lot of times there's set visits involved in those jobs. There's a lot more financial stability because you're signing with a larger entity that's putting you on a prolonged contract. Um, so for those reasons, I've you know I have a lot of friends who have been attracted to that and have done really really well. Um, and I think it's a great gig to have. But I think you have to ask yourself, what kind of person are you? Um, because it's not the same way that what I do is not meant for everybody. Doing that is not meant for everybody as well. So I think you really have to have a really keen awareness of who you are and what you're looking for. And a lot of that can be contingent upon where you are in your life. If you're in your 20s, you may want to be more risky. if you've entered your 30s and you're married and you're about to settle down, you may want to look into something more stable. Um, does that help answer like the spectrum of them?
Definitely. And just like as a general follow up to that, are those types of jobs like, is it is it directly contained within the film industry? Is there like subsets within huge production companies and like networks and stuff that do that, or is it kind of separate, like the film industry kind of hires marketing agencies and ad agencies and stuff like that to do the work, or does it just depend?
There's very few production companies that have the size and scope to have in-house distribution arms. Not to say that they don't exist, there's just very few of them. Mainly you're talking about distributors. So when you're looking at
Got it.
like Warner Brothers, Universal, Paramount, 30 West, there's a bunch of places that are what we would call major studios, and then we call them mini major studios. They have distribution arms, but there are production companies that are doing both, where they're developing, distributing across the board. But a lot of times you'll see them as they're called foreign sales agencies. Um, and so that's like, it's a different department inside of a business that finds financing for pictures through foreign countries that are fronting you money in exchange for a discount price on a property that they know the writer, director, actor, and producer of. And they'll wait for the delivery of the DVD for a year in exchange for a discount by fronting the money now. And then that's how those companies front the bill for production. And those places tend to have distribution arms inside of them.
Mm-hmm. And would you say, because I know A24, I'm sure most people are tired of hearing A24, but I'm pretty sure A24 started as like a distribution, kind of buying, selling pictures, and now they're slowly moving into more production-based activities. Would you say that's the new trend that the industry is going into, or just one anomaly?
No, I mean, one, great question. I think it has a lot to do with the upside, right? So here's the kicker. If you can finance production, you have the opportunity to make a lot of money. The problem is most movies don't make money. So if you're financing production, you have to be able to withstand an abundance of losses. So you have companies that made their fortune by doing something else, and then they're ready to take the gamble to front the bills on production in exchange for the payoff. So for example, if you made a movie, let's just do like simple math. You make a movie for $10 million and there's $10 million of advertising in it. And $10 million of advertising, which we call P&A, has a 30% premium on the dollar for interest. So you make a $10 million movie, it has to do $23 million to break even. Well, that's a tall order, but let's say it's the 1 out of 10 movies that does $100 million. There's a $75 million, well, $77 million surplus on that picture, right? If I'm the producer of that movie, that means very, very little for me because I was paid from what the budget was and I own a very tiny percent of the back end. But if I fronted the $10 million for the production and I had another company front the 13 million for the P&A, I own at least 50% of that back end. So now you're going, wow, on that $10 million investment, and there's a 75 surplus divided by 2, I've got $37.5 million on my original investment. Where those are the types of pictures where you go, wow, we made $37 million in a year versus where I'm doing a servicing job, putting together the distribution plans and the marketing plans, where you're making, fees based on budget, but they're fees. They're good money, but they're not multi-millions of dollars. And if you can get to a system where you're turning out 1 or 2 of those pictures every 2 years, you start to become a major player pretty quickly. And A24 has done a really good job of that. And they've done a really good job at picking movies that the budgets are moderate, but the commercial viability is high. So you're fronting the bill for a sub $10 million picture, and some of these pictures are doing $100+ million at the box office.
Hmm. So I guess in that sense, that both production companies and individual writers want to have quantity, so that if you wrote 10 scripts and 9 of them failed, you have that one script to earn enough revenue to sustain everything.
Yeah, it's a great note, Tiger. Like the big thing I always say is like one movie's gonna make money, and this is a little pessimistic towards odds, but I'll just this is close to
Hmm.
actual numbers. One of them's gonna make money, two are gonna break even, seven are gonna lose, right? And it takes years to get a movie made.
Hmm.
So, you know, um, it could take you 10 years, 15 years to get 10 projects made. So if you started at 25, you'd be 40 years old by the time you had one successful picture statistically.
Hmm.
Um, so if you're a young writer or director and you're peddling that one passion project, you're probably going to be broke your whole life and it's probably not going to work out for you. You
Hmm.
have to come to some level of compromise and say, I don't love it, but I like it, and that's enough. Now, a lot of people say that's really confusing in a business where I'm in this for the creative art and the vision. And I think there's a wonderful middle ground between art and commerce. And you have to be able to see the forest for the trees, or you will become someone who is doing this as a hobby, but could never actually provide financial stability unless you're willing to have a slate large enough that you're willing to develop the property. If it's something you like, great, make it something you love.
Hmm. Right. And about A24 and kind of production companies, kind of A24 is able to kind of move from distribution and then slightly move into production. But would you say it's the same way with individuals who are trying to eventually end up in the production side of the industry? Is going into distribution or marketing a viable way to get there, or would you recommend kind of mailroom, building the connection network, and then that's the better route?
The quote unquote better route is mailroom agency and then leaving to go work for what's called a term deal at a network or studio. That's the quote unquote traditional route. That said, if you don't have any like, I'm not a product of nepotism. My parents weren't in this. My grandparents weren't in this. If you don't have any relationships in entertainment and you get a job for working for a distributor or working in the acquisitions team of a distribution company, take it. Take any job you get in entertainment and do not wait for anybody to tell you you're ready to start looking for the job you want to do. There was a great Harvard commencement speech, and the whole thing was called Quit and Quit Early. And I'm a big believer in it. You've got to get into the lane of what you want to do as quick as you possibly can. So if you don't dig what you're doing you know, for long enough, you got to get out. And you got to get out because primarily it'll start to deteriorate the creative itch we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
You've got to stay in a lane where your creative itch keeps moving. And if you're in a position, and that's a good tell. If you're at a point where you're like, oh, fuck that script. I don't need to write that. I'm busy and working 12 hours a day at this shit and I don't have a break. It's a good indicator. You should always be able to find time for that thing. But that would be, you know, traditional route is what I said. And if you don't have that opportunity, anything, anything at all inside of entertainment and try to maneuver quickly.
Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. So if you guys are listening to this, there's a ton of ways to get involved in the film industry. Like that's what you want to do. And I want to ask Jesse real quick how he realized producing was the right role for him in this huge machine.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was in the mailroom. The goal was to become an agent. Um, I was working for an agent in the motion picture talent department as his assistant. We dealt with a bunch of producers who, would be getting casting ideas for their projects. And the agency is a very tense environment. And almost every time we got on the phone with a producer, they were so happy. And they seemed like on a beach in Malibu somewhere, having a very comfortable experience. And like the conversations were slower because they would talk slower. Agents, when they talk to each other, it's rapid fire. And producers, just they kind of like easy breezy. And I thought, man, that feels like a life I'm pretty jazzed about. And then I had the opportunity to. There was a producer we were helping cast a movie for, and his assistant um, got let go, and he reached out to me and said, "I'm going to Texas in 2 weeks to go shoot this movie for 3 months. Do you want to go with me?" And I said yes, and that was how I ended up falling into producing, and it's been very fulfilling for me. It is not a job that has any. Um, I am what you would call an outgoing business. If I wake up in the morning, there will be no phone calls and no emails for me. Every single thing that we do is self-generated. Um, and so my success and my failure is my own, right? And there's something really daunting about that, and there's something really rewarding about that. And I think if you're someone who can make your own schedules, then I think it's something that is really worth pursuing. But it requires a degree of discipline. But I definitely think being a producer is like being an actor in the sense that there is zero resume requirements. Like, how many actors do we all know? And it requires a headshot and a resume with community theater on the back of it. Well, being a producer is the same thing. There's no like degree, right? There's nothing. It just, how many people do you hear are producers and you're like, what the hell does that mean? There's a million producers, but the varying degrees of credibility lie within the job that they can get done, right? So if you're like, well, is it a viable producer or not? Just look them up. Just see if they've been able to get things to the finish line. And I think that was an interesting job for me, was the idea that I could succeed or fail on my own terms, and that's what led me to wanting to be a producer.
Hmm. And do you happen to be living in Malibu drinking alcohol while you talk to agents?
I live 3 blocks off the beach in Venice, and it ain't Malibu. I can tell you that it's not Malibu. But I also feel like I'm not done yet. I feel like I've got a lot to do, and I think over the next 20 years, if I can keep moving a couple miles up the road, I got a shot. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Oh yeah, of course, man, of course. Well, guys, thanks so much for having me. This was really awesome.
And thank you so much for coming onto our podcast, helping our with the panel session. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And that is the second episode of Friendly Professional Storytime. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.